This is the Trans-Siberian Railway, a brace of iron that encompasses almost the entirety of Russia, coming in at roughly 8,400 kilometers in length when construction finished in 1916. For comparison, that's just over 2.5 times longer than the United States' own transcontinental railway, which topped out at 3,270 kilometers. The US line was built through a far less hostile landscape, through more populated areas, and with a clearer economic benefit to the state, linking up the highly productive west and east coasts. In comparison, the Trans-Siberian was built in often freezing temperatures, through hostile terrain, and to an entirely unproductive region of Russia. So why did the Russian state go to such unprecedented lengths to connect east to west? And how in the end did it overcome these challenges? The history behind the railway and its construction is fascinating. It is one of imperial ambition, autocracy, and a man who has become synonymous with the project, the Russian Minister of Finance, Sergei Witte. The Trans-Siberian Railway was first and foremost a political tool. It was supposed to expand and maintain the power of Russian autocracy. There had been some concern during the late 19th century among the Russian political establishment that Siberia would develop its own power structure parallel to the state due to its remoteness. This, of course, would have meant Siberia would be harder to control. In the mind of Alexander III, this was a terrible possibility. It threatened the Tsarist principles of autocracy. The Tsar was terrified that the Russian monarchy might lose direct control over the proceedings of the state, a fear instilled in him after his father's liberalizing reforms turned sour, revolts broke out, and the iron-like grip Tsarism once had over Russia and her people began to wane. He wanted to ensure nothing like that would ever happen again, and the railway across Siberia was one of the ways in which he intended to reassert the monarchy's authority and ensure the remote territory did not slip from its control. Echoing his emperor, Konstantin Nikolaevich Pozyet, the Minister of Transport for Russia from 1874 to 88, argued that, quote, "Until there is a railroad across all of Siberia, it will be estranged from the general system and political life of the Russian state. The unification of the nation via a state-controlled railway project, as opposed to privately constructed ones that were built in the United States and Canada, would be the cherry on top. A rejection of Western liberalism and a vindication of Tsarist autocratic rule embodied in iron and steel." There was, of course, also an economic aspect to it. The untapped potential and hidden riches of Siberia just waiting to be exploited. Catherine the Great had called it Russia's India, Mexico, or Peru in that regard. However, these economic and even military considerations were secondary to the political benefits that the state envisioned. Initially, the Russian state elected to pursue a short southern route from Nizhny Novgorod to Tyumen, much to the chagrin of the Minister of Transport, Pozyet, who had proposed a northerly alternative. This, however, turned out to be an unexpected boon for his line. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 88, combined with poor harvests and a decline in global grain prices, caused the ruble to tumble. As a result, imperial comptrollers rushed to mitigate the damages on the imperial balance sheet, and some of the first cuts to be made were targeted at railways. In short, not only had Pozyet's foes been dealt a serious blow, but he had also avoided the setback of winning the railway bid and then being unable to complete it due to monetary restrictions. Once the state's finances had recovered in 1884, Pozyet reintroduced his route, but now with an extension deep into Siberia, starting in Samara and stretching all the way to Vladivostok. As luck would have it, his proposal was successful at the second time of asking, and he would have likely seen the project through had disaster not struck. In 1888, 2 years after his project had begun construction, and after bureaucratic inertia, disagreements over finances, and bickering among regional elites, a fateful railway crash guaranteed his departure from Russian political life. On October 17th, Tsar Alexander's imperial train derailed near the town of Borky in eastern Ukraine. The dining car in which the emperor and his family had been relaxing in was flung from the tracks and overturned. Miraculously, there were no fatalities and no one was seriously hurt. The cause of the crash was excessive speed. As Minister of Transport, the ultimate responsibility lay with Poziet, and although it seems he was not forced out, such an accident caused him to tender his resignation. The line upon which the accident occurred, the Southwestern, was actually managed by one Sergei Witte and not by Poziet directly. Born into a lineage of civil servants and lower nobility, he had clawed his way up the imperial bureaucracy, using what few connections he had to maneuver himself into positions of power. He was a near Machiavellian figure. Strangely, despite the line being Witte's, he suffered virtually no political setback due to the accident. Counterintuitively, it appeared that through the crisis he had managed to form somewhat of a bond with Alexander III. Witte had sounded the alarm bells on the dangerous speeds being taken by the imperial train on his line before. His warnings had of course not been heeded. When he had been scolded by imperial officials for demanding lower speeds on trips in the past, he had erupted into a monologue on how he would rather not, quote, bash in the head of the emperor, which higher speeds would surely do. The Tsar overheard the commotion, and while he was dissatisfied with his brazenness, recognised Witte's capabilities as a railwayman. This personal bond, as well as Witte's capacity for political manoeuvring, saw him move up the rungs of the imperial bureaucracy over the next few years, taking over the post of Minister of Transport in 1892 and finally becoming Minister of Finance the same year. As Witte ascended the ranks, his focus shifted from supplanting his political rivals, who had now either retired or been forced to resign, to the Trans-Siberian Railway. This period of Witte's career as both a politician and a railwayman can be characterised by his almost singular focus on the task of completing the Trans-Siberian Railway, and he was a force to be reckoned with. A meticulous and intelligent operator, he would bend the clunky Tsarist bureaucracy to his will in order to accelerate the financing, planning, and construction of the line. In this vein, he created the Committee of the Siberian Railroad, through which he fast-tracked policy decisions that already had the Tsar's approval, avoiding the lengthy debates that would have hampered progress in traditional bureaucratic channels. His complete focus did come at a cost, though, mostly to his wider duties as finance minister and the welfare of the peasantry, whose interests he would sideline in favour of the railway and whose taxes he would raise to an eye-watering level to fund the project. There was also the more literal cost to consider. According to Witte's own estimates, the price of the railway amounted to nearly 2.5 billion rubles, which converted to dollars and adjusted for inflation would be roughly $52.6 billion today. Over a 12-year construction period, from 1891 to 1903, that amounted to nearly 15% of Russia's national yearly expenditure, an absolutely staggering amount. This did not seem to faze the emperor, who had appointed Witte precisely because he would do everything that was necessary to get the job done quickly. Just a month after Witte entered office as Minister for Transport, the project began. The Tsarevich, Nicholas II, travelled to Vladivostok and laid the first stone for the construction of the Great Siberian Railway. With the young heir apparent having broken ground on the 19th of May 1891, the Trans-Siberian Railway began construction. From the get-go, Witte and his construction committee knew it was going to be a titanic challenge to source all of the required materials. Principally, there was the issue of transporting said materials into the remote Siberian hinterlands, as much of it could not be locally sourced. For this reason, the Committee of the Siberian Railroad embarked on an adjacent infrastructure effort that saw Siberian rivers and canals expanded and improved as to facilitate the Siberian supply chain, To put it another way, the Trans-Siberian Railway was such a massive undertaking, it merited its own infrastructure initiative to support it. The resources that would ultimately be transported down these navigable waterways were composed of roughly 454 million kilograms of railroad spikes and joints. Initially, Witte imagined that a large share of the required materials would be produced domestically in Siberia, but when this failed to pan out, production was instead shifted to European Russia, the United Kingdom, and Poland. But in addition to the difficulty of transporting resources to Siberia, an equally difficult task was labour. The number of people to work on the project over the course of its lifespan is unknown. However, archival material and expected workforce requirements penned by the Trans-Siberian Railway Committee put the active working population between 57 to 80,000 workers. This is comparable to, if not greater than, the Panama Canal's peak workforce of 60,000. Some historians, such as Christian Vollmar, have contended that the workforce rose as high as 200,000 workers at peak construction. However, I cannot confirm if this is the case, as his work did not cite a source. Needless to say, the manpower required was immense, and most of the labour had to be imported from European Russia and some even from China. There simply wasn't enough labour in Siberia to accommodate the Trans-Siberian Railway. The committee thus spent roughly 30 million rubles in order to facilitate the relocation of European labour into Siberia, a sum that today would be the equivalent of $630 million. Estimates from the Russian state archives and from historians such as Igor Naumov put the total migrant influx between 1 to 1.2 million people from 1893 to 1902, many of whom would undoubtedly work on the railway. Convict labour also featured prominently, with the average number of convicts on each section of the line numbering around 5,000. They were joined by exiles from European Russia and were one of the most stable working populations available. This army of labourers would work in some of the most remote parts of Russia, in extreme climates and under difficult conditions. A total of 2.2% of the workers would perish, with injury rates climbing as high as 10%. While these numbers are quite high by modern standards, they pale in comparison to similarly expansive contemporary megaprojects such as the Panama Canal, whose fatality rate climbed as high as 12.7% during the French-led construction from 1881 to 89. Convict labourers had it the worst though, at the mercy of their guards and taskmasters, who in the absence of much of anything else to do in the Siberian wastes, imbibed themselves with vodka and set about tormenting their captives, often killing them in cold blood. Alcohol was not only abused by the enforcers though. Statistics attribute 2% of all worker deaths on the project to alcohol poisoning. It seemed that many turned to drink to stave off the tedium and hardship of the Siberian wastes. Some of the most dangerous jobs involved demolition efforts. Poorly manufactured dynamite and irresponsible work practices led to many deaths among the workforce. Along the Circumbaikal route, workers dangled pendulously from cliffs above the deepest lake in the world while they placed dynamite charges. Sometimes, scaffolding was employed, but the work was treacherous regardless. Indeed, many of the deaths were due to hazardous working conditions. One railway journalist wrote that, quote, owing to the extreme cold, bridge engineers would allow their body temperatures to run down more than they were aware, with the result that some of them would slip or find they could not get their numbed fingers to grasp a support in time, falling into the granite-like frozen river below, being killed instantly. Living conditions for the workers also often left much to be desired. One newspaper, Stepnoy Litovsk, or the Steppe Gazette, reported in 1893 that labourers working on the West Siberian line were initially forced to sleep on the wet ground right up until the frost of winter set in. It was only after a year of complaints that the state contractors in charge of the line finally acquiesced, agreeing to build wooden huts for the workers. The Trans-Siberian Railway would be mostly complete by 1898. However, some critical eastern portions of the line would not be built until 1916. In the meantime, the full line would be serviced by a route through Chinese Manchuria, being replaced by the Amur Railway in 1916, which meant that the railway was at that point fully within Russian borders. Lake Baikal would also take some time to be conquered, with no railway being planned between the Irkutsk terminus on the west side and the Misovaya station on the east, due to the challenging terrain surrounding the lake. Plans for a route past the lake would be shelved until 1898, and the railway would not be completed until 1904. In the years without a rail connection to the rest of the network on the other side of the lake, 2 ice-breaking steamer ships, one capable of carrying up to 28 fully loaded freight cars and another built solely for the purpose of transporting passengers, bridged the gap and provided a critical transport link. However, these steamers were generally quite unreliable, meaning that the railroad was effectively bottlenecked. This problem reared its head most clearly during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, where Russian engineers attempted to build railways over Lake Baikal's thick ice in order to transport troops and military equipment to the Eastern Theatre, as the steamers simply didn't have the capacity to facilitate a transcontinental war. When the railway was finally completed in 1916, it would only be under Tsarist control for a year before the Russian Revolution brought its new owners, the Russian Provisional Government, and then the Bolsheviks, into power. While I would love to speak about the historical significance of the railway during the Russian Civil War, the Soviet era, and even its place in the modern-day image of Siberia, this is a task better left to a dedicated video. As it stands, the Trans-Siberian Railway was one of the greatest megaprojects of the 19th and 20th century, involving the efforts of thousands and featuring the zeal of one of the most famous Russian statesmen in Sergei Witte. It is unique in that it embodied an ideological conflict between liberalism and absolutism, a railway that sought to vindicate the idea that state-run projects could succeed where unfettered capitalism couldn't. But like many other 20th century megaprojects, it came at a human cost. In the sense of labour abuses, poor working conditions, and of course the death toll, and also the sacrifices that the average Russian made to fund what was effectively the gigantomania project of an autocrat and his railwaymen.